Are you tired of failed relationships? Are you ready for something guaranteed to last? Try Bullseye TM. We never miss the mark. 6 girlfriends, 3 casual relationships, and a list of one-night stands longer than anybody would care to admit. That's when I realized it was for me. Todd Martrosh could be very convincing. He had asked me out for drinks for what I assumed was a business proposal. I had never guessed that it would wind up becoming a discussion about our love lives. I like to think I've had a pretty good track record when it comes to my exes. None of them were crazy, and every time we broke up, it was for the right reasons and it was mutual. I kept telling myself that it just wasn't the right time. Todd was trying his best to convince me that time was right now. Chelsea isn't like any other girl I've ever met. We laugh at the same jokes. We have the same goals. It's like we're meant to be, Todd explained. I still don't know how this is any better than Tinder or eHarmony, I argued. The app itself didn't look like anything special. The icon was a bright red heart surrounded by 2 rings, and the sign-up page reminded me of one of those surveys from 16 magazine. I promised him I would give it a try, mostly because he wouldn't stop singing its praises. When I got home, I found that the same was happening on the review page for the dating site. In fact, during the 3 weeks that it had been out, not a single bad report had been made on it. Not a single 4-star review even. People generally all agreed that the app never got their matches wrong. That struck me as odd. 100% customer satisfaction, guaranteed successful. Already it had achieved Best New Dating Site of 2018 on both Google Play and the App Store for iPhone. Those kind of statements made it sound like the app was infallible. I have to admit, my curiosity was piqued, and I viewed debunking the site as some sort of challenge. I decided to run a test and began answering the questions on the survey in the most obscure way possible. I lied about my age, my looks, even my sex. As I got further through, the questions started getting more and more specific, asking for experiences, past relationships, that sort of thing. I made up as much as I could and clicked submit. It only took a few moments for their bot to give me a generic thank you message and reassure me that their algorithm was analyzing the results of my survey and it would take at least 24 hours to come back with a match. I wasn't expecting anything to come of it. Then I figured I could chalk it up to just people wanting to find love and believing the program had found their soulmate. Then my results came back. Honestly, I was surprised. The person the app matched me with was perfect. We shared common interests, goals, and they even fit my appearance preferences right down to ideal height. That's why I was shocked. This person shouldn't match me 100%. I had fabricated my answers as much as possible, but it was like the app completely disregarded what I'd said. Somehow, Bullseye had shot through all the bullshit and hit me dead center with the match of my dreams. I debated with myself about how to proceed. How far did I really want to test this? Ultimately, I decided to push forward with my effort to debunk this thing. The makers of the app had designed it so that, unlike any other dating apps, you couldn't message each other. Their approach was to have people fully take each other face to face instead of building preconceptions via text. To arrange the date of your life, you simply input your availability, activity preferences, and spending parameters into the in-app calendar. From there, the app would do the work of planning an itinerary, select a time and date that worked for both parties, and then send a notification of where to be and when, as well as suggested attire. I input the necessary information and waited for the notification. My plan was to scope out the location and my prospective date to see if the person who showed up was in fact the person it paired me with. I couldn't put a finger on it, but something about this just felt off and I wanted to figure out what. With a bit of time to kill before bed, I decided to dig around for more information on the app. There really wasn't much to find, which was kind of expected with a beta. I remembered seeing the app was owned by Veneer Inc. when I'd skimmed the terms and agreements, but a search for them just brought up some unrelated mythology info. I couldn't come up with anything else to dig into, and it was late anyways, so with that dead end, I shut down my laptop and went to sleep. The next morning, I got up and started a pot of coffee. Checking my phone, I didn't see any new notifications, so I grabbed a quick shower and went to my home office. I shot a quick text off to Todd to let him know I'd given the app a try and proceeded to lose myself in work for the next few hours. Todd ended up calling me later to discuss the business we should have talked about over dinner the prior evening, and once again, our conversation circled back around to Bullseye. I'm telling you, man, you won't regret it. When is your date? Maybe sometime we could do a double up with you guys, Todd inquired. Slow down, dude. I'm still waiting to get notification for details, so I'm not sure yet, but I'm excited to see what all this is about. Who knows? Maybe I'll meet my Chelsea. I laughed. We switched back in conversation to cover a few last-minute business things and hung up. I'd skipped lunch earlier, so I decided to order in dinner and call it an early night. Just as I sat down to eat, my phone buzzed and alerted the notification chime. I unlocked it to find a message from Bullseye. Guess who had a date? The notification had info regarding the time and place of my date. Café d'Amour, a perfectly generic French restaurant at a street I'd never heard about. That's where I would allegedly meet my match made in heaven. Having at least a certain amount of experience in the dating world, I developed a routine. Not something I was too proud of, treating each date the same way, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I threw on a shirt, not so fancy I would look like a tryhard, but also nice enough to impress. I checked Bullseye for any new notifications, cancellations, change in venue, that sort of thing, but there were none. Cautiously optimistic, I hailed a cab. Driving myself would be a disadvantage should there be an opportunity for drinks. The place was awkwardly situated close to the outskirts of town, but looked well kept and on the higher end of restaurants and bars. I paid the inflated cab fare and headed inside, checking myself in the window reflection to make sure I looked decent. It wasn't the largest place I'd ever seen, just about 10 tables scattered around inside, far enough apart so that a private conversation could be held uninterrupted. It struck me as odd that each table was only meant for 2 people, clearly decorated for romance. A waiter greeted me as I entered, confirmed that my booking was made through the Bullseye app, and informed me that my date had already arrived. Each table was occupied by 2 people, all seemingly on a date, impeccably dressed. The waiter escorted me to one near the back, the only one with a free chair. I knew she was my date before she even introduced herself. "Hey, I'm Isabel," she said as she embraced me in a hug. "Sorry, maybe a bit too forward? I'm not really used to these things." "That's alright," I chuckled. I never mind a good hug. No sooner had I sat myself down at the table before a waiter arrived with drinks for the both of us, a White Russian for her and a tequila sunrise for myself, my guilty pleasure favorite. "Did you order these?" I asked. "No, but they somehow got my favorite." She looked over at mine and smirked. "I guess you also enjoy the fancy drinks, huh? What kind is that?" "No idea how they knew that," I responded, mildly embarrassed. "Hey, no judgment from this side of the table. People should be allowed to enjoy whatever the heck they want." We quickly got to know each other, sharing the usual superficial details about our lives. Truth be told, it felt as if I already knew her. She matched my dream girl to a T. "How did you end up on Bullseye anyways?" "Through a colleague who may or may not be too involved in my love life." "Yeah, I know the feeling. Always being pushed out the door. It's funny how the people in our lives think they can live it better than ourselves." In meeting my date, I had almost forgotten about my initial suspicion. I was simply having too good a time with her. "It's a bit strange though, don't you think?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "Well, I got matched with you pretty much instantly." "So?" "I mean, I couldn't find much information about this app online, except that the company is named Veneer, so it struck me as strange how, well," she paused, "you kinda matched my requirements perfectly." I smiled, a mixture between being flattered, but also how strange it was that she matched my requirements perfectly, despite having put in nothing but false information. My smile quickly faded. "Sorry, is that too much?" No. It's just that you're right. It's incredibly strange. You also match perfectly." "Really?" I couldn't tell if she was happy or nervous. To be honest, all the personal info I put in my app is false, even my own gender. That being said, can't be many fish in the Bullseye sea. I noticed one of the other guests had been staring intently at me while I was talking. As soon as I noticed, he quickly returned to his conversation. "Hey, "Is that guy staring at us?" she whispered to me. I turned around to get a glimpse of another man quickly redirecting his gaze. It had become oddly quiet in the restaurant. "You sure he wasn't just checking you out?" I joked. She playfully rolled her eyes at me. "I wish. There was a woman earlier who also seemed a bit too interested in our conversation." "Yeah, I noticed someone else as well." At that point, the music fully came to a halt, and people were no longer sipping their drinks, but quietly whispering about something. The waiter approached our table with a new pair of drinks and an assortment of appetizers. "These are on the house," he said, "as a thank you for volunteering with Bullseye." "What do you mean Before I could finish my question, the waiter had returned to the front desk. "I feel like we're being pranked or something," Isabel said. "Yeah, maybe," I responded, not fully convinced. An uncomfortable knot had started developing in my stomach. Something was very wrong. But my gut is telling me something is going on here, and it'd be a good idea for us to get out. I stood from my chair as Isabel glanced around at the other diners who now all had their full attention on us. I could see a look of unease washing over her face. She began to rise from her own chair. "Hey, come on, just relax. Everything is on the level, I promise. You do still trust me, don't you?" A familiar voice came from behind me, and I turned to find myself face to face with Todd. "Look, how long have we been friends now? Do you think I would steer you wrong?" I wouldn't have recommended Bullseye if I thought there was anything to worry about. He was dressed up in a nice white tux with his hair slicked back and a smile spread wide across his face. "Listen to him, Isabel. You can have what Todd and I have been blessed with. Real, genuine love. I promise. The ceremony is perfectly safe." A woman I hadn't noticed before was standing behind Isabel when I turned to see the news source of the voice. "Chelsea, why are you here?" As soon as I heard Isabel speak that name, I knew it couldn't possibly be a coincidence that Todd and I had been matched with two women who were also friends. Todd and Chelsea began moving toward our table as they were joined by all the other cafe patrons who had left their seats. "What's going on here?" I asked Todd, demanding an explanation. I stood up to confront him, and then he suddenly grabbed my shoulder and forced me back into my chair. "Please, I told you there's no need to worry. Everything is perfectly fine. After the ceremony, you two lovebirds will be together forever." The way he said it told me that this was not something I wanted to be part of any longer. I did the only thing I could think of and told Isabel to run. She didn't have time to respond as we were close to being surrounded. She simply rose from her chair and spun toward the door in a single motion, and I followed closely behind. I could see now why we'd been seated near the back. We had to somehow slip past almost every person there to make an escape. I was honestly impressed by how far Isabel made it before they pinned her down. She was almost to the Madrid station when someone tackled her and they fell to the floor. I barely made it half as far myself before I was also taken down and dragged back to our table. Then the group started to chant, "You were found worthy and chosen for the ceremony. You are destined for each other. We never miss the mark." Chelsea rested a hand on Isabel's shoulder, and I just barely realized what was happening before the syringe in her hand plunged into Isabel's neck. "Hey, what are you—" Isabel's words trailed off, and her head rolled to the side. Todd gave me a look of disappointment. "I really thought you'd cooperate. That is why I picked you when they selected me to find a new candidate. Fortunately, there are ways to make this work." He began to grin wider as he pulled a second syringe from his pants pocket and took a step towards me. "Ceremony" was the first word that I recalled when consciousness found me. Instinct kicked in and I began to struggle, expecting to feel the strain of ropes around my wrists and ankles, but warmth and cloth were all that held me in place. I sat up and kicked the blankets away. The room was small and decorated like a 2-star hotel in Middle America. I scanned the gaudy decorations and faded wallpaper as I stepped onto vinyl flooring made to look like wood paneling. The door, large and the color of steel, was the only thing out of place besides the window to my left, which reminded me of the kind you might find in a police interrogation room. My feet had barely touched the cold floor before three things sent me diving back for the covers. Isabel was still unconscious in the bed I'd woken up in. We were both completely naked, and we were being watched. When I was beneath the blanket, Isabel began to stir, and then to panic. "It's all right, we're all right." I tried to sound reassuring, but I don't think it registered. Where am I? She looked me in the eyes, and despite her fear, I could see in her eyes that she was upset with herself for excluding me. Where are we? She amended. It didn't take long before she reached the same conclusions as I, and although we hardly knew each other, she felt compelled to move closer to my body for safety. Why'd they bring us here? She whispered. I could feel her heartbeat speeding up as we lay there together, confused and scared. I'm not sure, but the best thing we can do is wait and watch for a moment to fight back, I told her. She turned her head so that our faces were close enough for her to probably taste the alcohol lingering on my breath. You're pretty level-headed for someone who's been kidnapped, stripped naked, and put in bed with a stranger. Is this a particularly good time to flirt? I teased. It actually felt good to lighten the mood, especially since we had no clue what might happen next. To be honest, I've been on some pretty shit dates and in some pretty shit relationships. Trust me, I'm terrified, but it's not exactly new territory. This doesn't even rank in my top 5. That's terrible. I started to turn my head away, but she placed a finger on my chin to stop me. You know, up until they struck me in the neck, I was having a great time. I felt like I've known you my whole life. She leaned in to kiss me, but before our lips could touch, a loud burst of static filled the room. Covering my ears did nothing to muffle the noise. And when it finally stopped, a few moments later, a light behind the two-way mirror came on, illuminating a group of at least 8 behind the glass with Todd front and center. God damn it, Matt. I told you to fix the speakers before we use this room again. This hasn't been my top priority, as you know, Todd. James told me. The sound cut out, though we could see the argument between Todd and Mark play out beyond the glass. When they finished, Todd took 3 deep breaths, smiled, and motioned for the microphone to be turned back on. It was a composure tactic I'd seen him do countless times before. It made me sick to think that I knew the person sitting next to me in bed, someone I'd known for less than a day, better than the man I'd known for years. Sorry about that. Now, you two seem to be getting along just fine without intervention, but the sad truth is that you've circumvented the process. Your connection has the potential for flaws. We can't risk you giving Bullseye a bad name by leaving your relationship up to chance. This is insane, Isabel yelled. You can't just put 2 people into a room and force them to fuck because your app is flawed. That's a crude way to look at it, for someone with no idea what they're talking about, Todd sneered. Jesus, make love then, she laughed. I didn't mean to offend your delicate sensibilities. You misunderstand me. Todd made a circular motion in the air. 2 of the men on his left exited the room. This isn't about sex. It's about creating a connection. It's about ensuring you two will be together forever. If you'd only followed the rules, none of this would be necessary. A grinding, squealing sound came in from the metal doors, as if an age-old mechanism was being used for the first time in ages. I put an arm around Isabel as she moved closer. This is real life, not weird science, Todd, I said, though my eyes remained on the door. You can't just create destiny out of thin air. That's where you're wrong, my friend. We held each other tighter, trying to protect each other, even as we sought comfort from each other. Some of the light was blocked by a silhouette of something large, something frightening, something that just couldn't be. As the lights adjusted, I found myself staring at 2 replicas. They looked just like Isabel and I, down to the most intimate of details. It was clear that they were in no way human at all, but how they were different than me or my date, I couldn't quite tell you. I immediately stood up and grabbed the replica of myself before pinning it to the wall. It was strong, more well-built than any machine I'd ever seen, but still, I fought. As you can see, we have no qualms with simply replacing you should we see fit. But things will go a lot more smoothly if you cooperate with us, Todd said over the microphone. The bizarre circuit grappled me and led me back to the bed. Isabel shivered and tried not to cry as the beings intended to take our place stood near ours and held us in place. Let the ceremony begin, I heard Chelsea announce. I felt my body give way, like I was being pushed into a dark hole and then left to be buried alive. I grabbed a hold of Isabel's hand and screamed, desperate to find a way to fight this. The whole room shivered and shook. The beings in front of my body opened their mouths wide, and a radiant light shot out and blinded me. I heard music. I felt my skin go cold, and then, abruptly, another burst of static erupted and the whole room stopped spinning. The creatures stood transfixed, as though suddenly unable to respond, and I looked toward the opposite side of the glass and heard Todd and his allies screaming incoherently. Isabel was unconscious, so I had to lift her into my arms and run towards the open door. Then I saw another figure standing in the hall, urging me to follow. It was Todd again, and suddenly, all of this was beginning to make sense amid my scattered brain. "Follow me if you want to live," he told me. We ran through the corridors of what looked like an abandoned movie studio, a massive storage unit filled with dangling suits that appeared to be made of skin, other replicas that were just waiting to be filled for their evil purposes. "Don't look forward, just keep going," he urged me. I kept Isabel close to me and ran towards the stairs. A loud, obnoxious blare hit the room again. We made it outside onto an abandoned country road. Todd joined me a moment later as the whole building began to go up in smoke and then pushed me toward an unmarked car at the edge of the property. Chelsea opened the door and ordered me to hop in as the building exploded behind me, and I closed my eyes and gave a breath of relief. We drove away down the dirt road, and a few minutes later, Isabel awoke and clung to the seat, surprised by the sudden shift in circumstances. "Can someone please tell me what's going on?" she asked. Todd tossed us a blanket to cover our naked bodies as we drove, and then he told us what he knew about the company that had almost killed us all. They were a cult. They believed they had found the key to unending life and wisdom from a creature they called Veneer. That wasn't its name, of course, but that was the name we gave it. It promised to fill our destiny as humans. All we had to do was just follow its orders, Todd said. We found out soon enough that it wasn't all that was cracked up to be, but by that time, it was too late. They had amassed a name for themselves and were setting things in motion to take over. Those things we saw, those other versions of you and Chelsea, that was just the beginning, I realized. He didn't say a word, but his silence was all I needed to know that it was true. We were dropped off after Chelsea stopped to get us some fresh clothes and told never to speak about Bullseye again. A few weeks later, the app disappeared completely and I returned to my normal life. Tried my hardest to forget about the whole thing and pretended that it was all just a high-strung and drug-induced dream. But each time I did, I would get a notification on my phone from Isabel asking if we could go on another date. Call me a fool for old-fashioned romance, but I finally gave in and even agreed to meet up with her at a Mexican restaurant. The conversation was pleasant, and we both agreed to count it as our first official date. I really want the relationship to work. There's just one thing that is bothering me though, and maybe I'm being paranoid. But when we were at dinner, Isabel seemed to know exactly the right drink to order for me. Maybe I'm remembering things incorrectly, but I don't think I ever told her what it was. I've always been a bit paranoid about meeting strangers, so avoiding the entire array of dating apps was at first a no-brainer. No thank you, I'd say, scoffing in disbelief as dating apps randomly became the new normal. Not for me though. I wasn't about to get murdered by some random hookup. A few months went by, and I watched as all of my friends went on dates. Lots of them. All from one dating app or another. Some of them even got into long-term relationships this way. And, to be honest, all the guys they met seemed totally fine, save for the overzealous few and their unsavory photo messages. Still though, I avoided downloading any and all dating apps like the plague, until I got lonely. Yeah, I know, hypocritical. Sure, I accept it, but it's only gotten harder and harder to meet people these days. Once I was out of university and had started my career, loneliness hit like a brutal hangover. I couldn't expect to stumble into a house party each weekend anymore, and a full day's work exhausted me too much to even try to go out and meet people the normal way. I was convinced I'd be alone forever. So, begrudgingly, I downloaded a dating app, then several more. The concept of swiping a certain way finally made sense to me, and I must admit, I got pretty into it. Is there any easier way to pass the time than to judge potential dating prospects with the flick of a finger? Much time as I spent on these apps, I still shied away from chatting with most of the matches, let alone meeting any of them. Even as I'd given in to this new method of dating, I couldn't distance myself from my initial fears. I listened to a lot of true crime podcasts, so maybe the constant stream of "don't ever let your guard down" in my ears blew a healthy fear of strangers out of proportion. I realize now, though, that my fear wasn't entirely irrational. It may have even saved my life. Listen, I don't claim to be a genius, but I'm fairly smart. I wouldn't meet up with anyone until I felt comfortable, until I felt like I knew them at least enough to make an informed judgment. So when someone I actually knew in real life came up on my screen, I was encouraged. I knew him. I went to high school with him. I felt reasonably safe with the idea of meeting him in person after all these years. I swiped right on his picture and put my phone down to brush my teeth. The screen lit up mere seconds later. We had matched. He swiped to indicate his interest in me as well. My first emotion was surprise. I mentioned that I'd known him, but mostly from afar. I didn't think he'd ever noticed me. Certainly didn't think that he'd be into someone like me. I went to this private school for ultra-rich kids. Worst 4 years of my life socially. But the school was stellar academically. I got a partial scholarship there, and my parents worked day and night to foot the rest of my tuition. That being said, this guy, let's call him Alan, was kind of a douche in high school. He wasn't nearly as bad as the rest of his friends, but he was certainly the stereotypical privileged kid in more ways than one. He barely studied, had a rotating cycle of girlfriends, drove a car that cost more than the down payment on my parents' house, and he got away with whatever he did, whenever he did it. Once I'd processed the fact that we'd matched, another notification came in, a message from Alan. Thinking back on the kind of guy he was, I almost left it on read, but then I thought, maybe I was being harsh. I mean, I wasn't perfect in high school either. Nobody was. I'd always kind of had a thing for him, so maybe I'd like him more now. Maybe he'd like me now. I responded to the message. Before I knew it, we were chatting late into the night. He was actually a decent guy, and funny as hell. I finally told him I had to get some sleep. It was nearing 3 a.m., and he asked me if I'd like to meet the next evening for a date. No pressure, of course, only if I was comfortable. I wasn't sure if I was comfortable, but I still typed in, sure, smiley face. After all, he seemed nice, was fun to talk to, and most importantly, I knew him. It wasn't like meeting a stranger, and I liked him. I got up the next morning and busied myself with idle house chores until afternoon. I took a long bath, did a mask, picked out my clothes, hair, makeup, the works. I hadn't been on a date for so long, but I fell back into the old ritual with ease. Squeezed into a black mini dress, I teetered out the door on a pair of heels. We met at some gastropub and caught up over dinner and drinks. He'd gone to college too, before taking a position at his family's company. He was doing very well, had grown up, but like me, was lonely now. Alan paid the bill despite my attempt to split it. At the end of the night, he'd ask if I'd like to go back to his place. No pressure, of course, only if I was comfortable. I was probably a bit tipsy because I accepted. Normally, I wouldn't dream of it, not out of some idea of what a proper lady should do, whatever that even means, but because I didn't feel I could trust anyone so quickly. But again, I knew him. Felt like I knew him, I guess. We popped into a liquor store and he let me pick out a 6-pack of ciders. He held the door of the cab open when it picked us up and rushed out to open it again when we arrived at his house. It was a nice place, of course. He handed me an open cider and we hung out on his couch for a while, just talking and sipping our drinks. An hour or so later, we abandoned 6 empty bottles on the coffee table and stole away to his bedroom. We had sex and it was nice. Good, not great. But I mean, is it ever really great the first time with someone new? Afterwards, I started to cram my foot into one of my heels, but he stopped me. Stay the night, he said. Let's just talk for a while. I was caught off guard. In a good way. I agreed. That's when things started to get weird. He got up, came back with mixed drinks. I was pretty thirsty, so I downed it pretty quickly. He sprung off the bed to get me a refill right away. I was a little confused, but I figured we'd already sealed the deal, so it wasn't like he was trying to get me wasted so I'd put out or anything. Still, I sipped the next drink a little slower, and when he got up to go to the bathroom later, I tossed the liquor out the window. Alan refilled my drink again. He was still on his first. He set my drink on the table and started to tickle me. Normally, I'd be beyond annoyed, but he really was cute. We started play fighting a bit, and everything seemed okay. Seemed like maybe we were going to go for round 2. Until he pinned me on the bed. A strangely serious look crossed his features. I don't want to hurt you, he said, but he pressed me down into the mattress a little too hard. He let me go though, so I let it go. He was back to the lighthearted, funny, sweet guy I'd been talking to. We talked and laughed for a while, and I'd almost forgotten about that one strange moment when he did something weird again. Alan stared off into the distance for a moment, as if he was listening to or waiting for something. I lost my train of thought and trailed off. He slapped himself, not too hard, but still. What? And muttered to himself, knock it off. That old paranoia started to kick in, and I got up off the bed, unsure of what to do. Sensing my apprehensions, Alan shook his head and grinned. "It's okay, love. Come here. Come back to bed." Cautiously, I wandered back over to the bed, and he accepted me with outstretched arms. He held me against his chest to be close to someone again. It felt nice. Sleep was close, too. I was nearly out when Alan did it again. He knocked his head into the headboard behind him, a little harder than he'd struck himself earlier, but not so hard he'd hurt himself. Like how sometimes I catch myself thinking about putting my hand down the garbage disposal, if only for a split second. "Quit it, seriously," he grumbled, a little sterner than before. My mind raced as I puzzled over how I should respond, or if I should respond at all. Finally, I eased my feet onto the floor, kissed him on the forehead, and told him I needed the restroom. I padded out of the bedroom and down the hallway into the bathroom. I needed some time to organize my thoughts, to discern my next move. I could no longer ignore my rising fear. I realized that, regardless of however sweet he had been all night, I no longer felt safe. I was in a virtual stranger's house. Nobody even knew where I was, and I didn't feel safe. He seemed like he was battling with something internal. And while I completely understand that doesn't inherently make someone dangerous, in fact, if he was hearing voices or something like that, he'd actually be more likely to be victimized himself than to hurt me. I splashed some cold water on my face, tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was safe. All of that went out the window when just seconds later, I heard a loud noise from the bedroom, something crashing into the wall with a loud thud. "If you don't cut it out, I'm gonna have to call the police." Then the shuffling sounds of a physical struggle, but Alan was the only one in the room, and I didn't want to be in that room anymore. I slipped out of the bathroom, moved quickly on tiptoes into the living room, then held my breath as I cracked the front door open. I exploded into the night in my bare feet. My shoes left behind were the farthest thing from my mind. I risked a look over my shoulder just as the lights of the front room flickered on. Alan bounded out the front door, exasperated. "Where are you?" he bellowed, feet coming down hard along the driveway. "Where are you, bitch?" He looked for a few minutes, but he never found me. I was lying beneath his neighbor's car, frozen in abject terror. Once I was convinced he'd given up on his search, I ran down the street, called a cab, and never looked back. He tried to contact me again, tried to put on that sweet facade again, but I wasn't having any of it. The vitriol in his voice as he shouted after me was so intense, so primal, that I knew how he really felt about me. I could never feel safe with him again. After escaping that night, I felt lucky. I replayed the story to my girlfriends over numerous drinks and anxious laughter the following weekend, boasting that I dodged a bullet with Alan, that he was not right in the head, that I'd lost a good pair of heels but saved myself a lot of grief. Years passed, and I didn't think of that night any further. That is, until his best friend, another guy from our high school, was tried for murdering one of his dates. The prosecution alleged that he chucked her off the roof of his parents' mansion, but he insisted she was a lunatic. She was drunk and had been acting erratic all night, so crazy and so hysterical that she jumped herself. He tried to help her, tried to stop her, but she was dangerous, aggressive. To prove his point, he handed over an audio recording of the hour leading up to her death. "You never know what you might get accused of these days," he claimed. "Best to cover your bases, right?" He was acquitted, got off on all charges, got away with no consequences, same as he and Alan always had in high school. To his credit, it did sound like she was behaving oddly, even aggressively. As he claimed, I've heard the recording. I've listened to it 100 times over. I've heard the soft sounds of blows falling. I've heard him tell her, a little too clearly if you ask me, to knock it off, cut it out. He even tells her that if she doesn't stop, he'll have to call the police. Right before she jumped. But I know the truth. I know the fucking truth. I know that he did it, but I can't prove it. And I know that I was lucky to have escaped that night. I didn't just dodge a bullet. I escaped my own murder. Allegedly, of course. I didn't see it myself, but it's clear to me now that Alan was recording our date that night. And if I hadn't run out of there myself, I would have left his house in a body bag. Alan wasn't hearing any voices, wasn't trying to silence intrusive thoughts, wasn't talking to himself at all. He wasn't even talking to me. He was performing for the jury of my future murder trial. Whatever you do, don't read this. Just delete your dating apps ASAP. The first time I saw those words, my day started off like any other. I went to work at my monotonously, mind-numbingly boring desk job, clacked on the keyboard for 8 hours, had the same bland ham and cheese sandwich for lunch. As I sat in the break room, halfway through my sandwich, I opened the dating app I downloaded only recently. I was a fairly good-looking guy, so I'd gotten plenty of matches and been on countless dates, but none of the women were really what I was searching for. Somewhere between shoving the last piece of my sandwich into my mouth and deciding whether or not to delete the app, my phone pinged with a match, Guinevere Motley. Curiosity got the best of me as I clicked on the notification and read her message. Whatever you do, don't read this. That was a strange way to get my attention. Usually they send a pickup line or something funny. Tapping on her picture, I noticed that there was only one, but geez, she was stunning. Long brunette curls cascaded over her shoulders and toppled down her back, and thick, dark lashes, adorned with seafoam green irises. My eyes trailed down the picture as I took in mile-long legs and tasteful curves. The little white sundress she was wearing looked like it was made just for her. Heck, this woman was a bombshell. When I went back to the message though, I realized that it had been deleted. Looking up at the clock, I noticed that I had about 5 minutes till my lunch break was over. With one more glance at her profile, I shrugged and deleted the app. She was probably a bot or a scammer anyway. That night, I did the usual. Ran to the gym and worked out for about an hour and a half. Picked up some tacos from my favorite food truck and sat down to watch an episode of Black Mirror. Everything was normal. That was until about a couple months later. By that time, I'd forgotten all about Guinevere's cryptic message. Let me start off by saying that my morning did play out as it normally would have. I slept in until about 10 a.m., then I spent the next hour out in the front yard mowing the lawn. It was a particularly hot day. My plain white t-shirt soaked through with sweat. Tugging it off, I set it on the front porch before edging the lawn. By the time I got it done, my hair was drenched and my shoulders were burnt red. When everything was put back in my shed though, I couldn't help but feel a bit accomplished. Besides Mr. Kelman's house next door, I had one of the nicest yards on the block. I noticed the door of my mailbox hanging open, and I trudged over there to check the mail before shutting it closed. On the way up my driveway, I flicked through the envelopes with uninterested fingers. Water bill, phone bill, bank statement, junk mail, advertisement, Arby's coupons, and then I paused. My fingers quickly came to a standstill when they landed on a plain, black envelope. Instantly, my interest was piqued. Turning it over, I saw that it was sealed with crimson-colored wax. Now I was really invested. Who even sends letters like this anymore? I slid my thumb under the seal, ripped open the envelope without a second thought, and tugged out the note inside. Thick, dark ink was scrawled across it, and I took no time in reading it. Let me guess. Despite my warning, you've decided to read this. I told you not to, but now it's too late. By the time you've made it to this point, there's little chance of turning back. The second your eyes landed on these words, you just couldn't help yourself. I guess I shouldn't blame you. I couldn't stop myself either. The curiosity was simply too much to handle. So let me at least tell you what you're in for. I'm going to warn you right now. It's not going to be pleasant, but you did this to yourself. Remember that. Pausing for a moment, confusion bubbled from within me at the words. What warning? Flipping the paper over, I didn't see any writing on the other side. That was until I glanced at the back of the envelope. I could have sworn that this writing wasn't here before. Surely I would have noticed it. In huge red letters, the words, "Whatever you do, don't read this," stared back at me. What kind of sick joke was this? With a quick glance around my neighborhood, I wondered if anyone had even seen who delivered the letter. My interest only grew when I realized that there was no return address. Heck, my name or address wasn't written on the envelope either. Perhaps this was meant for someone else? Surely, if it was for me, they would have addressed it to me. Brushing it off, I ripped it to shreds and tossed it in the garbage. Right about that time, I noticed Miss Brookfield on her front porch looking over. A smile stretched across her face as she raised her hand to wave at me. Offering a wave of my own, I suddenly got an idea. She was a nosy old bat, and she always seemed to sit out on her porch on mowing days. But in this instance, it might prove to be helpful. Maybe she had seen who delivered the strange letter. Sauntering across the street, I walked up the steps to her front porch and offered her a smile. "Hey, Miss Brookfield, how you doing?" A shiver raced over me as I watched her pale, blue eyes slide up and down my shirtless chest before speaking, a mischievous smile tugging at her lips. "A lot better since you're here." A vulgar little chuckle escaped her brightly painted lips as she finally met my eyes. "I might be past my prime, but I've got the most beautiful little granddaughter that might—" "Miss Brookfield," I started, cutting her off. "I apologize for interrupting, but the reason I really came over here is because I received a strange letter in my mailbox." One silver brow raised as she waited for me to continue. "I guess I was wondering if you'd seen anyone deliver it." "You mean the mailman?" she fired back, sarcasm melting into her words as she fanned herself. "No, not the mailman." I laughed a little awkwardly before saying, "I think this letter was hand-delivered." With a shake of her head, she stood and walked over to her front porch. Pulling open the screen door, she threw me one more glance. "I see almost everything that goes on in this neighborhood, and I can assure you that the only person I noticed stopping at your mailbox was the mailman." "Okay," I started. "Thank you, Slamming her screen door shut, she left me before I could even finish my sentence. I guess since the show was over, she didn't want anything else to do with me. I shuffled a bit in place, then shoved my hands into my pockets before scampering across the street and back onto my property. Nasty old woman wasn't helpful at all. With a quiet scoff, I threw open my own front door and strolled inside, making a mental note to keep my shirt on next time I mowed my yard. Sunday was uneventful, and the strange letter was honestly the last thing on my mind. I had a spreadsheet I needed to get done for work, and I had to present it at 8 a.m. the next morning. My day flew by almost as fast as my fingers flew across my keyboard. If this presentation went well, I was sure it would end in a promotion and a raise. Monday morning, I woke up and was running a bit late. Luckily, I pressed and starched everything the night before, rolling up the sleeves of my cusp, white button down. I quickly threw on a tie, stepped into a pair of black slacks, and slid into some shiny black loafers. With a glance in the mirror, I carted a hand through my still damp hair before deciding to add a bit of gel, hoping it would stay in place long enough to survive the meeting. Everything that could have gone wrong that morning did. Throwing my car in reverse, I peeled out of my neighborhood and onto the freeway. Two people pulled out in front of me. I had to swerve when a chair came toppling out of an overly packed pickup truck, and then to top it all off, I managed to get stuck in a traffic jam that was moving at a snail's pace. The time was ticking by, and as each minute passed, I was getting more irritated. My boss wasn't a man who would accept any kind of silly excuse, so in 15 more minutes, I was good as dead. Trying to calm myself down, I switched through the radio stations, but strangely, all of them were static-filled, except for one. My fingers froze on the knob as a strange feeling of dread washed over me, the voice coming through the radio, cutting through all the noise outside. "Ryan," the voice, a sort of breathy whine, crackled over the sound system in my car as it whispered, "You read it, didn't you?" A mixture of confusion and indescribable fear began to blossom deep within me as I stared at the screen. Looking at the radio station, my eyes widened as I saw the station number, 66.6, glared back at me. What the actual— "Ryan," repeating my name again. The voice wavered a bit before a hissing sound filled the car. It was so ear-splittingly loud that I clenched my eyes shut and attempted to block out the noise with my hands. When I finally pulled them away from my ears, the hissing sound dropped to a low buzz, and something warm dripped from my ear. Running a finger over it, I quietly panicked when red stained the pad of my fingertip. With shaky hands, I reached into my glove compartment for a napkin and cleaned myself up as best as I could. By the time I glanced up at the clock, traffic was still at a standstill, and I half expected the time to slap me in the face when I looked over at it. Instead, it still read 7:45. Closing my eyes, I blinked a couple times before peering at the numbers again. What the heck was this? A minute later, the traffic cleared up, and I was moving again. I twisted the knob on the radio, trying to change the channel to something different, the incessant sound of the buzzing noise driving me insane. But that's when I heard it again. That voice. "Ryan, how do you know my name?" I shouted. I must have looked absolutely ridiculous, but I didn't care. "How?" I repeated angrily. "Ryan, I told you not to do it. It's too late now. You've read it." Ice-cold terror ran through my veins as I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "Listen to me," it whispered, the voice on the radio a strange sounding warble over the fuzzy static that was beginning to rise. "I want you to swerve out into traffic." "What? No," I shouted, my anger simmering dangerously close to outrage. Without so much as a second thought, though, I watched in horror as my foot pressed down on the accelerator and my hands twisted the steering wheel. Within a matter of seconds, the sickening crunch of metal rang through my ears as I crashed into another car. The impact knocked me out cold, and when I awoke in the hospital sometime during the night, I learned that it was because of the airbag. The concussion I gained because of that made me feel like my thoughts were swimming through a thick blanket of fog, but that soon cleared up within a few days. What didn't clear was the guilt that hung over me like a cloud. The people in that car weren't severely injured, but I did find out that it was a mother and a young child. Both of our cars were totaled, but despite everything, it was written off as an accident. It was determined that I'd passed out before my car swerved into the other lane, but I could have sworn I was conscious. The voice told me to swerve. I was sure of it. That's what made me feel so horrible about the whole situation. I would have taken full responsibility. Guilt was a heck of a feeling, and I hated every second of it. I should have spoken up. I should have taken accountability. I should have fought just a little harder to block out the voice. When I finally made it back to work at the end of the week, though, I was pleasantly surprised to find that my boss had looked over the spreadsheet that I'd emailed and decided that despite me not being able to present it like I'd intended, he was very impressed. In fact, he wanted to see me in his office at 2 that afternoon to discuss it. Deciding to go ahead and take my lunch, I headed to the break room and pulled out my usual sandwich. For some reason, I was only able to eat about half of it though, before I started feeling kinda sick. My eyes darted around the room for a trash can before I finally ran over to the sink. Gripping the edge of it, I wasted no time in emptying everything in my stomach into the sink. The horrible burning sensation in my throat made tears well up in my eyes as I tried to get myself under control. And that's when I heard it. The little radio sitting on the counter flipped between about a dozen stations before it stopped on one. "Ryan," it whispered. "No, please no." I sputtered out through gritted teeth. "I want you to put your hand inside the garbage disposal." A small sob broke from my lips as I watched my hand once again betray me. Slowly, it dipped towards the sink, closer and closer, until, "Oh hey Ryan, I didn't know you'd come back yet." The sound of one of my coworkers successfully broke the trance, and once again, my hand was mine. "Steph, could you turn off the radio?" My voice was shaky and uneven as I fought the urge to vomit again. "What do you mean?" she asked. She grabbed something from the fridge. "It is turned off." A nervous laugh bubbled up from my throat as I cleaned myself up and turned to face her. My hand reaching up to scratch the back of my neck awkwardly. "Right, yeah, sorry," I managed to stutter out. A sympathetic smile tugged at her lips as she unwrapped her own lunch. "Are you okay?" "No," I wanted to scream. I'm so freaking far from okay that I'm hearing voices. But instead, my hand came to fidget with the sleeves of my button down before I rolled them up and said, yes, I'm still a little out of it." I locked eyes with her and tried to play it off, just a little brain fog still. With a mouthful of salad, she simply nodded in understanding as she chewed. Based on her expression, I'm not sure if I convinced her, but that was the last thing on my mind. Throwing up a hand, I waved to her as I strolled out of the break room and back over to my cubicle. As I took a seat in my chair, my leg bounced anxiously. I wish that envelope hadn't ever shown up in my mailbox. I wish whatever this was would quit happening. I wish I'd never even read any of that letter. Another much more worried part of me wishes I'd have at least read it all the way through. Maybe it might have provided an explanation about why I'm experiencing all this and how to make it stop. There's no way I could constantly live my life on edge, worrying about my own body betraying me at any given moment. A glimpse at my clock didn't make me feel any better. The meeting with my boss was in 10 minutes. Whatever confidence I'd worn that morning had now melted into a thick sludge in the bottom of my stomach. With clammy hands, I pushed myself up from my chair and made my way across the room. The second I stepped in, he smiled up at me and pointed towards one of the chairs in front of his desk. "Take a seat, Ryan." Nodding, I sat down in one of the leather chairs and tried not to fidget. "Now," he began, his voice gruff and gravelly, "let me pull up those spreadsheets real quick so we can go over them. I was really impressed with your work, and I think..." The shrill scream of his office phone interrupted the conversation, and he was quick to pick it up, holding one of his calloused hands up in a silent apology. Yes, Farah." He paused before peering up at me. "Yes, he's in here." Would you like me to give him the phone? Pulling the phone away from his ear, he offered it to me before going back to looking at his computer. The second I held it up to my ear, all of the blood drained out of my face when I heard the voice on the other end of the line. "Ryan," it rasped. "Do you see that pen in front of you?" My voice wavered, and my breaths were uneven as I replied, "No." The slim silver pen gleamed up at me from the desk, but I refused to play into this game any further. "You're lying to me," the voice hissed. A glance at the phone screen made me feel like I was losing my mind. The phone number read 666. Whatever this thing was, it impersonated Farah and was able to contact me through a number of ways. "I want you to grab that pen and stab it through the palm of his hand." I broke out in a cold sweat as my other hand drifted towards the pen, my boss still typing away. "No," I repeated, a little more firmly this time. "There has to be a way," I sputtered out before settling on, "What did the rest of the letter say?" The silence on the other side of the receiver was loud as I waited for a reply, my hand halting for a moment. "If you want this to stop, there's one simple thing I need you to do," the voice said, its tone strangely excited. "Anything," I begged, desperate to be free of the curse. "Pass it on." The next couple of seconds, I listened to this thing tell me the most vile, sinister things I have ever heard in my life. I can't even repeat it, but please know, by the time you finished reading this, it's really too late. You're already interested. You won't be able to help yourself. All I can say is that I warned you. Whatever you do, don't read this alone.